afternoon. It is now 3 p.m. on Tuesday, October 22nd, 2024, and I'd like to call the Strategic Planning Ad Hoc Committee meeting to order. Madam Clerk, can you take the roll, please?
Branham? No. I apologize. Yes. Livingston?
Here.
Mackey?
Here.
Newton?
Here, present.
We have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you. Next item on our agenda, well, let me recognize all of our guests in attendance. Ms. Barron, thank you for joining us. Yes, Councilman Branham, thank you. Vice Chair Pugh and Councilwoman Teratio, thank you for being here with us this afternoon.
I promise not to try to vote.
Yes. Next item is approval of minutes from September 24th, 2024.
So move, Madam Chair.
Second?
Motion is second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk?
Livingston?
Yes.
Mackey?
Yes.
Newton?
Yes.
Motion approved.
Next is the adoption of the agenda. Any additions, deletions? Good. All right. I'll entertain a motion.
So move.
Second?
Motion and a second. Madam Clerk?
Livingston?
Yes.
Mackey?
Yes.
Newton?
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. Our items on the agenda today for discussion and action are two items. Items 4A and B are public-private partnership update, and then item 4B is a resolution. And before I have Ms. Emily Luther come forward, I want to just give a brief kind of update and reminder to our committee members, but also others in attendance today. We have a roadmap, also known as a boxcar graph, which I just learned today. We have a roadmap for what we have called our P3, so public-private partnership, that the Strategic Ad Hoc Committee has been following, and we are now at the second to last step in that roadmap. And so today we'll be getting an update on where we are and kind of combining all that information together. And then our next step, which is moving forward in action with a resolution for the P3. Ms. Luther, you are recognized to go through our update. And I guess remind everybody, some of this is stuff that you've seen before, and some of it is a little bit of new stuff. So Ms. Luther's going to try to get through it, so there is time for us to also talk about 4B. But along the way, if you do have questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Chair Mackey, members of the committee, and guests, council members. Thank you for having us. And when you were adopting the minutes, I was thinking it's hard to believe that it's been nearly 30 days since we were last here. It does feel like time has flown. But since our last meeting, the P3 Advisory Group, which was a group that was called to assist the county in considering the public-private partnership and its functions, its board members, kind of its key objectives, held one additional meeting since your last meeting. And so we are going to, as Chair Mackey said, step through kind of this PowerPoint. Some of it is a little bit of a refresher, just to remind the group what we did talk about at our last meeting, and then the update from that last P3 Advisory Group meeting. So, Madam Clerk, would you mind sharing the PowerPoint? We can just quickly step through that. And we can go, we've already discussed the agenda slide, so we can go on over to the timeline. Again, this just reflects the first box is where we've been and where we kind of currently are. And then there are some additional forward-looking events that are occurring in November with the consideration of the P3 by council, of course, after consideration by this committee meeting of those agenda items that Chair Mackey referenced, and then potentially a launch event, and then the transition. But now for a review, next slide, please. The P3 Advisory Group was a group that was called about 5 to 7 members for the purpose of having citizen or private sector input on the creation of the public-private partnership. It was a limited duration and it was meant to be just an advisory group only. But we did have robust participation from a wide sector of the private sector. If you wouldn't mind flipping to that next slide, again, reminder of the individuals that participated. Wonderful group, thanks to recommendations from council members about this group. They were very engaged, very enthusiastic about the process, about the concept. You'll note that we have banking, we have education, we have real estate, and we have other kind of professional members as well as members from our industry. Next slide, please. In total, the advisory group met 4 times. In addition, Chair Mackey was present along with Councilman Livingston at all of the meetings. The county attorney and the county administrator also attended. Each one unintentionally, but lasted about 2 hours. The conversation was always very robust. And there was a lot of thoughtful participation at the meeting, but we were also impressed with how the members kind of thought through what we had discussed and the agenda items for the upcoming meetings. Several of them sent us written responses and written thoughts either before or afterwards. Next slide. The discussion topics that we really covered in these meetings were what would an organization like this function as? What would be a successful organization? What would it look like? What should be its priorities? The funding and the name and brand are still something that kind of eluded the group, but they did have a consensus on some concepts, which we'll get to. So for the recommendations that appear on the next slide, the recommendations were that this P3 organization should be relevant, respected. It should address the priorities that council sets, and it should also have a county-wide impact. As far as the board composition, on the next slide, their consensus was that it should have 2 council members, 3 council appointees, and 4 private sector members, just so that the balance of the board members would be council people or council people adjacent. The co-chair idea was one that the P3 group focused on for kind of the initial positions, that a co-chair of this group for the initial few years would help provide some legitimacy to the group, also help get it off the ground. And that co-chair position they envisioned or recommended would be held by a council appointee or member, and then also a private sector, so that we would have both components leading the organization together in those initial terms. As far as funding and organization, on the next slide, they viewed it as something that needed to be county funded, but also would want to have some private sector support. The executive director and employees would be under the P3, and then the P3 board would be the body that was accountable to council through budget, through strategy, through approving some of the key employees like that executive director position. And as always, all legislative functions would remain with council. So approving incentive agreements and things like that, that would always remain with the council. Next, on the priorities, a core function, again, set by council would be the main priority of the organization. Those would center around workforce development, community engagement, not just individual community, but business community engagement, and then foster relationships. This is something we talked about at the last meeting, but foster relationships among the groups that are already providing economic development activities or services in the county. So this would be an organization that could really harness and lead those other organizations and activities. On the last slide, this was a little bit of an interesting discussion that we had, was mistakes to avoid. And so, these individuals that gathered had either experience in other P3 organizations or other economic development adjacent organizations. And so they did have some very thoughtful information or ideas on mistakes to avoid so that this organization could remain relevant and robust. One was scope creep, which was not to do too many things. And also, as we discussed last time, to not be a duplicative organization, but something that was new and really elevated the county in a way that has not been done or is not being done presently. And also a clarity of mission, again, one that would be set by council through its strategic objectives. Lastly, on the next slide, this is something that we've talked about, the name and brand. At the last meeting, staff from the county presented a possibility that we engage some professional assistance in developing the name and brand of this organization should it move forward. There's some budgeted dollars in the Economic Development Office that it is going through its own rebrand. So to the extent that this organization is approved and moves forward, the thought was that there could be some assistance from some professional organizations to help with the name and the brand. But specifically a geographic marker, so communicating to everyone that this was an organization of Richland County for Richland County. And Maceo Nance, who was on the group, and he was adamant that no one should ever have to explain what it means. So at the last meeting, that kind of catches us up to the last meeting that we had with the P3 organization. The last meeting, we kind of updated them on the discussion that the committee had at its September 24th meeting, and then we asked the group for some final thoughts that they wanted to share or make recommendations for to this committee about the P3. Those recommendations really centered around what would be an ideal board candidate, and then also what would be some final thoughts that they would have to share with the committee about the recommendation. So first, turning to their recommendations on board members. They did not express any individual names, but more criteria or qualifications. First and primarily, they wanted the board to be a diverse board and reflective of the county, the entire county that the P3 organization would be representing and promoting. Secondarily, they wanted the board member to be community-minded and committed and dedicated to the organization's mission. They were adamant that this should not be a figurehead position that a board member would hold, but one that would be a board member would be actively engaged. This would be an important seat for them to take the time to be engaged on. Thirdly, the board member should have relationships and skills sufficient to connect people in the county or connect organizations in the county, again, to kind of be that leading, connecting organization. And lastly, the board members should be knowledgeable about the county's economic development landscape and the council's ongoing strategic plans and initiatives. And I apologize for that typo. And then lastly, the board shared a few final thoughts for the staff to consider for the P3 group. On the next slide, you'll see those final thoughts. Importantly, the P3 advisory group, supported the conclusion that the creation of a P3 would move Richland County in the right direction in terms of its economic development efforts. The P3 would help the county maintain and amplify its current momentum, particularly in light of some of its more recent successes, like the Scout announcement and some of the other larger investments that have happened and been announced in recent years. Critically, the P3 and county council should have like-minded mission and expectations, and that really will come from setting the objectives and purpose of the P3 so that they are aligned. Lastly, the organization should be one that is recognized for its excellence in executing the mission. So overall, that is the summation and recommendation of the P3 advisory group. And next, we have some information about the bylaws.
Just before she moves on from the advisory group, having attended those meetings, I just want to say that in all my years, I think this is one of the most impressive groups that I think got together to work on. Also committed. Every meeting. I was extremely. I worked with a lot.
Yes, definitely had. Thank you, Mr. Livingston. Before we go to the next section, which is bylaws, did folks have any questions or comments or clarification on any of the final recommendations and thoughts coming from the P3 focus group? Hearing none, if you would move forward to the bylaws section. Thank you.
So the bylaws section, and you have a copy of the proposed bylaws in your packets. We've just highlighted a couple of areas where we think the messaging and discussion from this committee about the P3 and then also the recommendations from the P3 advisory group kind of come together in the bylaw provisions, particularly in the composition of the board of directors. You'll see that in the bylaws, the board is going to consist of the chair of county council and the chair of the county council's economic development committee. So those would be the two members that would serve ex officio. And then 3 members appointed by county council. So not necessarily county council members, but they would serve at the appointment of county council. And then there would be a 3rd group of board of directors would be additional members from the private sector that would be what we call kind of perpetual succession or a self-perpetuating board, where those members would be nominated and elected by the board of directors. Those 4 members would then kind of nominate and elect their successors. They are from the private sectors. Again, as we discussed, the initial co-chairs of the board will be the chair of county council and a private sector. Following that initial chairmanship, after the launch and kind of transfer of operational powers in those initial years, we envisioned that the chairmanship would then transfer to a single chair, and then the other officer positions would be vice chair, secretary, treasurer, and then an officer of a chief executive officer, which would be an employee of the P3. Again, qualifications of board members, residents of Richland County, they would serve in staggered terms. And so that means that there would never be, kind of like how the county council is composed, there would never be a full turnover of the board. They would turn over a tranche every year, but not the entire board. And they would be term limitations. Currently, the contemplated term limitation is 2. And then we would envision that the members of the board of directors would be leaders in the government and business sectors. But there's not necessarily specifications about what sectors or any type of position held within a business community, because we want to make sure that we're able to meet those other qualifications that were identified as important: being engaged, having certain skills and knowledge about the county's economic development activities. So we haven't necessarily made specific qualifications so that we can focus more on the substantive criteria and identifying individuals that can meet those substantive criteria. Next, you'll see the purpose of the P3, and this is defined again in a way such that the P3 is acting to carry out the strategic goals of county council in its economic development activities. So the language of the bylaws limits the P3's organization and operation to a couple of very exclusive and limited purposes. And you will see that is for the efficient and economic promotion and enhancement of the economic growth and development of the county. And we envision that this organization would become an integral part of the larger operation of the county's economic development community. Some specific activities are included in the bylaws, but overarching those specific activities, the broader purposes would be encouraging, enhancing, and fostering economic development, as well as assisting in promoting, formulating, and supporting programs designed to encourage and enhance economic development, all in accordance with the county's strategic plan and initiatives. And so on the next slide, we have more of a visual representation of how this will function. I think this is a slide that you've seen before. I'll wait for it to come up. But we call this the circle of the life in the public-private partnership. And it really is how this organization is governed and how it relates to county council. You'll see that county council has oversight of the P3 organization through appropriation of funds for its operations, approval of that chief executive officer, and then again, you receive updates accordingly, as well as you are appointing or serving as the majority of the directors through those 2 ex officio positions and 3 other appointed positions. And then from the language of the purpose and its objectives, you'll note that the organization really is an administrative operational arm of the county's economic development functions, but that all legislative functions of the county's economic development functions, such as approving incentive agreements, setting the strategic goals and policies, remain with county council and the committee that functions for economic development. And so on the last slide, just highlights where we've been and where we are in that orange boxcar.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ms. Luther. I do want to take a minute and open it up for committee members and all council members in attendance today for any questions related to the bylaws. This presentation was really a highlight of some of the key points within the bylaws. The full document is in your strategic planning packet if you want to read the full thing or ask particular questions about the full language of the bylaws. The focus group was very, very important to the process, as Mr. Livingston stated, but also the many meetings that we've had in this committee and council members have attended and provided feedback along the way was made sure that that was incorporated in the bylaws as well, and that we combined both of those to produce something that we felt would be a successful organization for the county. And so I'll open it up now for any discussion or questions. Raising your hand, Ms. Teresia, you're recognized.
Hi, thank you. So I'm just looking through, particularly the process around the board, and curious about, 2A is great, the chair of council and the chair of the Economic Development Committee, the 3 members appointed by Richland County Chair. Would that go through rules and appointments?
I'm sorry, where are you at?
So number, tenure, and qualifications of the Board of Directors, it's Article 6, I guess.
Okay, in the bylaws,
In the
gotcha. I'm
bylaws,
with you now, okay.
Right, okay, and then, so 2B is 3 members appointed by Richland County Chair and the Chair of County Council's Economic Development. I guess my question is, are these not going to go through the regular rules and appointments process?
It would not. And
Okay.
so it would be a decision for the body as a whole, and that's a process we would send through Economic Development Committee.
Okay. I'm having a little bit of heartburn around, kind of not going through our usual application and interview process, and having the full body. Well, I guess they would present options to the full body to vote on and not have it go through rules and appointments?
Correct, it would go through Economic Development Committee. But I will say, I think looking at the 3 council appointees and how we look at what that would look like, I think we have to think about, depending on term limits and what our priorities are for this board, that, I'm not sure if that's something where you're putting it out for application, whether it's more of, well, if it's a workforce development, if there's certain key issues and things that we really want the P3 to be focusing on, is that not more of a discussion where council members are saying, yes, I believe this business or this industry type person is where we need to be, and us working together as a whole to bring those names and talk about it through committee versus putting it out? Because I'm not exactly sure what the advertisement may be, because it may change each time around based on the priorities that year.
I have some further thoughts on this, but I'll let others ask their questions.
I want to make sure, I do want to answer the question, but if there's anything else, Mr. Ratio, please, because I don't want her to change a topic. If there's something we need to talk about or a suggestion that you have, I think we should definitely put it out there.
Okay, Ms. Barron, were you going to speak to this?
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yes.
So I had a similar question, and I do think that it would be a great idea for council to come up with framework for those individuals that we're seeking to fill these spots, very similar to what we did in the past with our other committees that we appoint for. And that is, we went to those organizations, whether it was the library, the hospital, and we asked them, give us a description of what it is that you're looking for. And even though there are some of the boards, they do have specific areas that we have to appoint for, even noting the change that may have to take place. I think that I do have some concern of what it could be perceived if, council, we are making appointments to individuals to sit on such a, and I'll use this word very, 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 very loosely, such what could seem to be a prestigious, a powerful group of individuals who are setting the tone for economic development for our county. So I would like to give us a little, I would like to have a little more conversation about how these individuals are selected, because I do think that it's critically important that it is transparent in our process as to when we can say, we selected this person because ... Not just because, we like this person, or we, and I'm not saying this body would do that, but because when we look at even our advisory board was selected, every council member had an opportunity to put forth a recommendation, and then from there, Parker and Poe made the decision on, okay, what's a good fit for this group. There was a process. So if indeed we don't go through our normal process of appointing individuals, then I would like for us to have a formal process that does give us, that is very clear as to how we selected individuals. Because as it states, and I know this is early on in our process, it does, Mr. Ratio says it gives a heartburn. I don't want to borrow her heartburn, but I will say I have some challenges with it.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. And I guess to address there's a process. There is a process. Mr. Ratio's question was, would it go through rules and appointments? And I said no. But the process would be that council members would make recommendations similar to how you mentioned with the focus group, and that would go to Economic Development Committee for discussion, and that's where it would go. So it wouldn't go through the normal rules and appointment process, but there is a process.
And so if that is the case, that would have been helpful for that to have been communicated. Because I didn't hear that. I might have been zoned out, but I didn't hear that today.
No, Ms. Luther did not specifically say Economic Development Committee, but she did state that there would be 3 council appointees, meaning that this body would vote on these people in public, and that these folks would be appointed to the board so that county council can maintain majority of the board seats. And the purpose of that was feedback that we heard that council wanted to make sure the board was not made up of outside private sector folks, that these would be folks that county council agreed and voted on and that they appointed based upon what we as a body decide. And so she did not specifically say Economic Development Committee, but she did call out 3 council appointees the body as a whole would approve and do that in public.
Right, so I don't want to belabor the point, and I did hear that. I did hear what she said, but the details that you just gave were not provided during this presentation. So as we move forward, if indeed, I think it's more, it would help for clarity to say, yes, we're gonna have 3 council appointees, the process, because again, in full transparency, anything that we do, there's a process, and people know how we appoint individuals. And I want this body to always err on the side of safety, and I'll just, I'll leave it there. I think that that's important. How they're selected, okay, I might can weave with that, bob and weave for that. But the other piece about this is I think that people need to know, and that's important. But I do have another question, and I'll just change the subject right there.
Well, I just want to, before we leave from that, and make sure that everyone is clear. Ms. Luther may not have gone into detail, but the presentation that she provided was a highlight of facts. And this conversation time is to ask questions and get into any other details or questions that you have outside of going through and reading the entire bylaws. And so I know we have a short amount of time, and so that wasn't something she went into detail with, but it was not in order to hide anything or skip over, but it was simply to make sure we got to leave time for open conversation. And so, Ms. Horatio, did that help answer more clarity?
Did. And I just wanted to speak out loud to this, in that it would be easy for me, for a person to see how, without going out for applications, that, a smaller group of council would go out and ask folks to consider serving in this way. And then by the time it would get to full council, there would be a limited opportunity for who to appoint. It would kind of, I could see there's a tendency to know the people that you know, to ask the people that you know to do things, and maybe to not have a larger lens. And so that is the part that I'm kind of getting hung up on, is to how do we make sure that we not only go out and ask folks to serve, but also seek folks to put themselves forward, who we may not automatically think of, like, oh, this is the person that I think of right off the top of my head to serve on the thing, because they're the person sitting right in front of me, or they're the person that I see at the breakfast all the time, or they're the person that I see at this or that meeting all the time. So that is the part I'm really concerned about, and I want to make sure that we are really, really, really reaching out to folks who are beyond the usual suspects.
No, I thank you for pointing that out. I think there is, maybe a way to think about that and look at both ends. I think about it from the perspective of the goal of this group. And when it comes to certain areas in economic development or workforce development, there may be somebody that we know has a deep understanding and expertise, and that person's not going to apply. We're going to need to go ask them, would they be considered? And so I want to leave space for that, because with this board, we need to have some people with some true technical background experience, but also that the body feels as a whole that they can help represent council on the board as well, right? Because the point of the 3 council appointees is that we can then have folks that are in alignment with our priorities as well and can help serve as that voice. And so when having it be application only, I feel like we limit ourselves on engaging the type of folks that we may need to be effective for this type of board. So, but I hear what you're saying, making sure we're not leaving somebody out, and so creating space for that to happen. I do hear what you're saying.
And certainly with some of our boards and commissions, especially the ones that require certain kinds of professions or something, sometimes those do take a little bit of encouraging folks to put themselves forward. So it happens even in the rules and even in the appointments that we do make. So yeah, I'll stop there.
All right, so I'm sorry, Ms. Newton, because before we went to Mr. Ratio, Ms. Barron did have,
I'm happy to
but
wait.
Ms. Barron, are you okay with pausing? Because Ms. Newton is actually on the committee, so you let me go. But I'm gonna come back to your second question, okay? Okay, thank you. Ms. Newton, you're recognized.
It's Sunday morning over there. So not to belabor the point, but I wasn't gonna say anything, but I would just like to express my agreement with what Ms. Teresa was saying, because one of the, and I can have heartburn, one of the sources of heartburn that I have about this effort is a fear that it's going to turn into this very small, self-perpetuating group. And so I hear your willingness that maybe it's a yes and, because there certainly are times when you know the person and you want to be able to ask them. But, there are times when you can create these groups where, all you get is the same exhaust that everybody's been breathing forever. And so that's just a concern that I have. And also when I look at the structure, I mean, if you look at even the current structure that we have, we've got our Economic Development Committee. That's probably, like, to me, one of the least representative committees that we have. And then you take a subset of the least representative committee and you take two people from that to be representatives on this body. So the chair would be, it's like this, you're pulling from the smallest number of people to go there. And then if you further limit those small number of people, by not having the broadest, I won't say application process, committee selection process possible, then that really troubles me. But I certainly understand too, even if you look at the Rules and Appointments Committee, that just, having an application in 5 minutes with a nice person doesn't necessarily give you everything you want to know, so that we look at really just amplifying whatever that process is.
Thank you. Ms. Barron?
I just had one other question. Will the focus group, are they done, or will they continue, are they continuing to meet?
They are done at this time. You're welcome. Any further discussion, questions? Hearing none. That was the update for 4A. If you look at 4B, it's a resolution authorizing the formation of a public-private partnership for economic development, approving the bylaws governing the business and activities of the public-private partnership and other related matters. Going to make sure that you all saw, in addition to the bylaws in the packet, on page 8, at the beginning of the bylaws, is a resolution that states what the steps forward would be and moving forward with the P3. If you remember, when we started this back last year, we began with a resolution. And so this is an update and extension of that resolution to move us to the next phase of the public-private partnership, which would then have the county administrator and the economic development director begin to start working through all of kind of those nuts and bolts to prepare us for our budget season next year. Any questions related to the resolution that's in the packet? It is, sir, yes. The resolution, which includes the bylaws, is 4B, an action item. Yes, sir.
Madam Chair, I move we forward that item to the full council.
I have a motion to forward item 4B, the resolution and bylaws, to full council for approval. I'll second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk?
Livingston,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes.
Newton.
No.
Motion approved.
Thank you. We are now at item 5, which is adjournment.
So moved.
Second?
Motion and second. Madam Clerk?
Livingston,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you.